Thank you everyone for coming. Today we're going to be discussing the history of chattel slavery in West Windsor, along with the broader New Jersey context. This lecture is going to run I'd say about 50 minutes long, followed by a questions and answers session. And because of the large turnout, if you're not already muted, but I think everyone should be, please do mute yourselves. Just because we don't want any interruptions. But do feel free to type your questions into the Zoom chat box at any time. And depending on, I have a number of different monitors where I'm looking, I might see it. And if not, we'll have a questions and answers session at the end where people can unmute. So one thing quickly I do want to do is a little bit of an intro to the Historical Society before we get into the lecture. So the Historical Society of West Windsor, we're an all-volunteer nonprofit run by your friends and neighbors, and none of us gets paid to do this, and we contribute our free time, including hosting this lecture. We manage the West Windsor History Museum off of Southfield Road. You can see one of the museum's buildings here. It's a farmhouse from the 1750s, and if you haven't been, I'd highly recommend visiting. We're about, I don't know, a 30-second drive north of Grover Middle School. We also do a number of other things. We lead preservation projects, we write newspaper articles, we manage our website and social media pages, we offer student scholarships, we run public events, and more. Now, a few more slides before we get into the lecture. One thing I'll point out, some of you may already know, a few years back we published a full-length book about West Windsor's history. It covers everything from the Ice Age to the present day. So if you want to learn more about local history, this is an additional resource you can use. It includes slavery, but it includes other elements as well. We're also in the process of, and we started a few years ago doing this, installing long-lasting history markers around town to highlight various historic sites. We typically design them in partnership with members of the communities they represent. And one that we dedicated this year was for a community called Glen Acres, which is one of the nation's earliest planned integrated neighborhoods built by civil rights activists in the 1950s off of Alexander Road. And then the final slide before the actual lecture begins, I really do ask that all of you please consider volunteering if you're not already. And I know we have a number of volunteers already in the chat. There are many opportunities to help out. No experience is required, and you can find the sign-up link on our website, which is the link at the bottom. You'll see that in a number of slides. History is not going to preserve itself, of course, and we really can't do more than we're already doing without more committed volunteers, so please consider stepping up. Now I think we can jump into the lecture. So broadly speaking, and this is a somewhat in response to a few questions that I got. Some questions were, what's the difference between indentured servitude, chattel slavery? Just more broadly speaking, slavery generally is a system in which someone's, subjugated, forced to work with little to no compensation, and denied basic personal freedoms and human rights. There are a number of different types of slavery, but people usually think of two common forms of forced labor, which is chattel slavery, which this lecture explores, and indentured servitude. To be clear, chattel slavery, which again we'll be focusing on in this specific lecture, means that an individual is legally treated as personal property, essentially, by the enslaver. So people enslaved under this system are essentially completely denied basic human rights and bodily autonomy and hold no legal standing or agency, almost always for life. It is what most of us picture when we hear the word slavery. It's what was most common in the United States. And under the system, children usually inherit their enslaved status from their parents, experiencing a multi-generational reality of destroyed families, dehumanization, and systematic oppression. In contrast, indentured servitude was typically contractual, less focused on treating the person as property, not inherited, and bound to a limited time frame. Often several years to pay off debts. Of course, both systems have abuses, but generally chattel slavery is the typical one people learn about historically. And because we only have an hour today, this lecture, as we advertised, will focus strictly on chattel slavery specifically and its ties to West Windsor. not necessarily much on indentured servitude. However, we do plan on hosting other lectures on indentured servitude and other subjects as well. One thing I do want to point out as well in terms of the sources that we're using for this lecture is we're relying mostly on primary sources. Things like manuscripts, newspaper articles, things that you can find at the New Jersey State Archives, manumission papers, West Windsor's municipal archives as well. The township building actually has a number of old records dating back to the 1700s. However, unfortunately, because the enslaved were often stripped of their birth names and poorly recorded by their enslavers, documentation is often extremely sparse, including for West Windsor. So we've been trying to research this subject for years, so they're not forgotten and are given the justice they deserve, but it does take time and effort to get the requisite documentation, if at all. So if you know of any research methods we could use to kind of improve our methodologies, please let us know. And in the meantime, again, if you want to help with this research, we are always looking for volunteers. Now, another thing I'll point out as we go through the lecture is that West Windsor, as it currently exists, has not always existed. West Windsor only got the vast majority of its current borders in 1853. Before that, our town used to encompass land up until Nassau Street in Princeton, which you can actually see in this picture here. And before 1797, West Windsor didn't exist at all. Instead, we were part of a larger township called Windsor Township. And if you go even further back, the governing entities changed even more. So, and we're going to get into that a little bit more in the lecture. So depending on the source, for example, a sale record might say something like Windsor Township in Middlesex County, because the area used to be in Middlesex County before Mercer formed. And due to that history, a lot of West Windsor's history with slavery overlaps with that of Princeton as well, and other nearby townships. Now, one question I also got before the lecture is, what's the relationship between slavery and the Native Americans who used to live here? So just to answer that, and for context, New Jersey's original indigenous residents were called the Lenape, and they settled here thousands of years ago. Now, they did they generally were a more peaceful indigenous society than a lot of others, but when they did have war, they did take prisoners of war, primarily women and children. However, while these captives initially served as subordinate laborers, they were generally given distinct opportunities to integrate into their captive community, eventually earning full tribal status and rights. This is fundamentally different from chattel slavery, which the Lenape broadly disavowed, in which the Europeans really are the ones to introduce. In fact, it was extraordinarily rare for the Lenape to practice it at all. Furthermore, while some Lenape were unfortunately captured by Europeans and forced into chattel labor, this practice mostly died out as the transatlantic slave trade shifted towards enslaved people captured in Africa. Colonial and municipal records indicate that virtually all chattel slavery in the West Windsor area specifically involved those of African origin or descent. So again, since this is lectures focus, half on New Jersey, half on West Windsor, I do want to point out that in West Windsor, basically every record is of someone of African descent being held in chattel slavery. Now, in terms of the origins of chattel slavery in West Windsor, I do have to go back and highlight kind of the broader context in New Jersey, which the next several slides are going to do. So Dutch colonists started establishing outposts in New Jersey in the New York area in the 1610s. And in 1624, the Dutch West India Company, which was one of the major players in the transatlantic slave trade, founded the colony of New Netherland, centered around its capital, New Amsterdam. You can see that right around here where I'm circling my cursor. That's modern-day southern Manhattan. In 1626, colonists tracked 11 enslaved Africans to New Amsterdam, just 7 years after the first recorded arrival of enslaved Africans in mainland English North America in Jamestown. And by 1630, enslaved individuals appeared in present-day New Jersey. The Dutch colonial government promoted slavery, seeing it as a way to build the colony, and New Amsterdam became recognized as one of the most active ports trafficking in enslaved Africans in North America about the year 1660. Now, New Netherland, of course, doesn't exist anymore because in 1664, the English annexed the colony and established their own colony of New Jersey and aggressively incentivized slavery as well. To attract settlers, the colonial government offered additional land grants in direct proportion to the number of enslaved people a settler brought to the colony. Consequently, the enslaved population surged alongside a massive wave of European immigration. In what's now known as the Garden State, quote unquote, enslaved laborers cleared the forest, they tilled the soil, they're obviously forced to do all these things and maintain vast networks of farms. However, they were also forced to be domestic servants in a lot of cases and work in urban jobs as well. As slavery in New Jersey grew, the province did introduce laws to control the enslaved population. The first of what became known as "quote unquote" slave codes was in 1682 in New Jersey specifically, which required enslavers to provide adequate food and clothing. However, it also criminalized resistance, promising to double the servitude time of runaways and heavily fine anyone who aided them. A separate act that same year strictly forbade colonists from buying or selling goods with enslaved individuals to prevent them from trading for resources as well. The act went so far as to offer financial rewards to any resident who caught an enslaved person trading, and authorizing them to actually administer, the person who caught them, to administer public whippings on the spot. So there were very harsh laws, but unfortunately they got worse. A law in 1694 further stripped away independence, restricting firearms used by enslaved persons and prohibiting them from keeping livestock like swine. To prevent community organizing, it fined free people who housed an enslaved individual without consent for over 2 hours and rewarded those who captured enslaved individuals who were found more than 5 miles from their plantation. The next year, a 1695 law established harsher trial mechanics for enslaved individuals accused of murder or theft, and punishments could be very inhumane. For example, and these are examples that I'm taking from, to be upfront, from Montclair University. These are ones that they've highlighted as well. One enslaved man named Cuffy, who was convicted of arson, was executed and publicly hung as a warning. Another named Quack was convicted of theft and sentenced to be dragged behind a cart through Hackensack and whipped 117 times. And for another named Caesar, who was convicted of murder, the magistrate ordered his right hand to be cut off and burned prior to him to being hung to death and his body burned to ashes. So, of course, very cruel punishments, in one case, capital. While these represent extreme cases, they lay bare the violence that those who resisted the racial hierarchy on which slavery depended could face. Now, after the turn of the 18th century, they again became even harsher. 1704 law, for example, firmly established a collective authority over virtually all aspects of life, from movement to socializing to trade and religion. Notably, it contained a provision for the castration of rapists and those who slept with white women, but this was disallowed by London in 1709. Now, I do want to emphasize that the enslaved weren't just victims. They were also, people with their own aspirations and lives that were nuanced and important as ours. And they often fought against their oppression with the tools that they had. For instance, captives destroyed tools, farm crops, and animals to hurt their enslavers economically. And one notable event was the New York Slave Revolt of 1712. In April of that year, in a desperate fight for freedom, over 20 enslaved West Africans set fire to a building on Maiden Lane and attacked colonists who tried to put out the fire with muskets, swords, and axes, killing 9. In the aftermath, colonial authorities executed 21. Some actually, in some cases, by burning them to death, and enacted much stricter slave codes. Now, those who were enslaved also resisted in more subtle ways as well. It wasn't always just, outright rebellion. For example, they often, well, rebellion is not the right word, but you know what I mean. They often preserved their heritage by creating a distinct African American culture. For instance, oral traditions served as a vital tool for survival and the passing down of history and intergenerational memory. Musical expression through work songs and spirituals didn't just bolster community bonding and elevate morale, they also embedded hidden messages of resistance. Cultural preservation culminated in regional celebrations like Pinkster, an originally Dutch holiday that enslaved people, especially in the New York, New Jersey area, transformed into a vibrant festival of African music, food, and dance. Furthermore, they melded West African spiritual beliefs regarding ancestral spirits with Christian practices. Through these enduring expressions, they maintained a resilient shared memory that refused to be erased. Now, I'm just waiting for the slide to load. There we go. As the 18th century progressed, the proportion of free Blacks in the state decreased. Yes, there were free African Americans in the state, and I know someone made a comment about that. And but as the time went on, the proportion of free Black residents in the state decreased, and slavery proportionally grew. Still, New Jersey officials did make efforts to curtail it. For example, in 1769, it passed a duty on the importation in hopes of getting more white servants into the colony. Still, by 1775, the population of Africans grew to more than 21,000 within 30 miles of Manhattan. Now, of course, none of this is to say that New Jersey's population was a monolith either. For example, most householders in New Jersey were not enslavers, and there certainly were anti-slavery voices in the 1600s. William Penn was not one of them. I want to be upfront about that. But in Quaker communities, there were abolitionist voices. Now, the Quakers settled here largely after William Penn, who was a founder of Pennsylvania, purchased significant land tracts in the area in the 1670s and 1680s. The Quakers generally favored small family farms over large plantations. And again, this is a generalization, but used enslaved labor less. They mainly settled in West New Jersey, whereas other colonists of a variety of religions and traditions from New England settled the more urbanized East Jersey, so slavery was more often found on the east side of the colony than the west. And in West Windsor, the West Windsor area, which basically it's technically was in East Jersey, but on the border with West Jersey, there was influences from both halves. However, again, as I mentioned before, William Penn being an example, not all Quakers were abolitionists. William Penn himself is known to have kept at least 12 enslaved people, primarily at his country estate of Pennsbury, north of Philadelphia. A powerful contemporary of his, pictured here, a goldsmith named David Lyle, is another known enslaver. One of his enslaved, named Tom, chose to risk his life by being an active participant in the New York slave revolt of 1712 that I mentioned a few slides back. And he was one of the ones that was executed as a result. Lyle is also known to have kept an indigenous person. I'm not sure if he was Lenape or not. None of the sources that I've seen specifically call it out, but kept an indigenous person named Nin enslaved as well. And this is where I can start to finally introduce West Windsor's involvement a little bit more, because William Penn and David Lyle, both of whom were Quakers, were also among West Windsor's first colonial landowners, who bought thousands of acres here in the 1690s. And this was the same decade that colonists started trickling into the West Windsor area specifically, although Penn and Lyle themselves never lived here. However, they are still recognized in the naming of Penn-Lyle Road, which was built in the 1860s along the old 1690s era division line between their two estates. Now, although colonists, as I mentioned, started trickling in the 1690s, it wasn't really until the 1730s that they started settling here en masse. They were predominantly of Dutch and English descent, the landowning families, and they were attracted by the area's waterways and fertile soil, and they established several small farming communities like Dutch Neck, Edinburgh, Growers Mill, and Penn's Neck. Now, we don't know the exact year that the first enslaved individuals arrived in the area, but they presumably came with these first families. And slavery's existence in the area, in the West Windsor area, is indisputable. Generally, about 5 to 15% of farms in the area held enslaved individuals. And of those, they usually had about 1 to 3 enslaved per farm. But there were some exceptions, and we'll talk about those in a bit as well. Generally, the enslaved workers, not enslaved workers, the enslaved individuals worked the fields, served as domestic servants, in much the same ways as the rest of colonial America. They experienced the same conditions as in a lot of surrounding states. They often lived in separate makeshift shacks, although in some cases, especially for domestic laborers, they lived in the house. From the few records that we have of them, it seems that they were often known only by their first names. It's relatively rare for the documentation that we have to find a last name as well. And for the 1 or 2 that do have last names, it's clear that they were given their enslavers' last names, like Updike or Voorhees. And perhaps most notably, because they were maybe 1 to 3 enslaved on the average farm, these people likely were isolated with no community to support them, possibly for their entire lives. Now, multiple sources prove the existence of slavery in Windsor Township. For example, we have censuses and tax rolls. There are tax rolls from 1778 for comparison that reveal that about 34 people were enslaved in the Windsor Township area. Again, this was back before West Windsor existed. But that number skyrockets dramatically by 1790 when a census for Windsor Township shows 190 enslaved. It's unknown what proportion were in the present West Windsor area as opposed to the East Windsor area of Windsor Township, specifically since, again, this was when neither township existed and we were part of a larger township, and you can actually see another census from 1772 right here. Although it does not specifically say if they were enslaved or not, the presumption is that most were. Now, another example, and one that we find in a number of places, is newspaper articles. I'm just waiting for the slide to advance. Here we go. So, for example, here is a newspaper ad from the 1782 Pennsylvania Gazette, where Thomas Norris is advertising the sale of an enslaved man. Thomas Norris himself is known to have lived in Princeton, but he also owned hundreds of acres between Clarksville Road and Village Road West, very close to where they intersect Quaker Bridge Road. Now, however, perhaps the most notable example that I can give of local slavery is Richard Stockton, who is one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Despite championing liberty and equal rights during the Revolution, he also had enslaved people at his primary estate of Morven. For example, he lent an enslaved man named Caesar to Princeton University in 1770 for some time. And yes, that is one thing I should point out, which is that Princeton University's history is also tied to slavery. There's a lot of resources out there to learn about that. And from 1765 until his death, Stockton also owned about 300 acres in modern day West Windsor. By the way, I'm going to pause myself for a second. Someone had a question, what documentation is there about the housing of enslaved? There is a variety of resources out there. In terms of in West Windsor specifically, we have very, very sparse records, but it's easy enough to find it online or go to a history museum. So it depended on the farm, depended on the situation. Now, getting back to Richard Stockton, again, he owned about 300 acres in West Windsor, where the county-owned Mercer Oaks Golf Course is today off of Village Road West. He likely kept this property as an investment property, and we don't know if he actually also practiced slavery there. But in any case, we definitely know there was practice at Morven in Princeton. You can learn a lot more about him, his ties to the Revolution, his fight for national independence, his practice of enslaving, since his estate is a public history museum. Now, especially during the nation's 250th birthday year, we also can't forget that the American, and this is a historic illustration that was done in 1781. We also can't ignore the fact that the American Revolution was defined by a profound paradox, which was that there was a war fought for individual liberty and natural rights, but at the same time, slavery remained widespread. In fact, many founding fathers like George Washington, Benjamin Franklin were enslavers. Meanwhile, thousands of enslaved and freed Black Africans fought as soldiers as well, many of whom actually fought for the British Army after being promised emancipation. Conversely, at least 5,000 Black soldiers served in the Continental Army and in local militias, including in New Jersey. Meanwhile, there are examples, of course, of other people who didn't necessarily fight, but were influential in their own right. Phyllis Wheatley, for example, was a Black poet who wrote praises of Washington's leadership, and she herself was enslaved, but shortly after that, she was manumitted. Now, while we don't know of any Black or enslaved soldiers from the West Windsor area specifically, we do know that some white soldiers, for instance, who fought for national freedom were also enslavers. For example, John Bergen wrote into his will a phrase claiming that his enslaved servants would have the quote-unquote privilege of choosing their next enslaver. Now, the revolution's egalitarian ideals ignited the first widespread anti-slavery movement in the Western world. It prompted northern states to enact gradual abolition laws, but as we'll explore, New Jersey was very slow and very reluctant in the taking of that, and encouraged individual manumissions in the Upper South. However, the United States ultimately compromised on slavery, and the resulting 1787 Constitution explicitly protected the institution, cementing this contradiction for the next several generations. Now, despite the revolution's ideals, slavery remained in place, as I've mentioned, following the nation's founding. Although an act in 1786 ended the sale of enslaved Africans imported from Africa and brought to New Jersey after 1776, it did not end the practice of cross-state sales. Now, in addition, when New Jersey drafted its first constitution, this is kind of an aside, in 1776, lawmakers granted voting rights to all inhabitants who were of legal age and had resided in the county for at least a year and owned property worth at least 50 pounds. This ended up meaning that New Jersey's free Black residents and women could also vote, but of course not the enslaved. And even for the women and free Black residents, this was short-lived because in 1807, the right to vote was repealed for these groups and restricted only to white male taxpayers. Now, Windsor Township split into East Windsor and West Windsor in February 1797, but slavery persisted after that, of course. Tax rolls from 5 years later, in 1802, for instance, show about a dozen enslaved individuals in town, suggesting that most of those who had been enslaved in the old Windsor Township were on the East Windsor side, but the number for West Windsor grew again. For example, in 1830, there were 21 enslaved individuals in West Windsor. But after that point, you start to see it decline again if you're just looking at the censuses. For instance, in 1840, there were 3 enslaved in town. And in 1860, census records record a single enslaved individual who was a 76-year-old woman named Diana Updike, who I'm going to talk about several more times throughout this lecture. Now, of course, it was also not unusual for those who were enslaved to want to escape to freedom, of course. And in West Windsor, this was no exception. Newspaper records frequently recorded the sale of enslaved people, and others printed pleas for the captures of runaways attempting to escape their bondage. One notable ad, for example, from 1819 is pictured here, showing a man named Christopher Bergen in West Windsor sending a public notice about a 40-year-old man named Henry, a 40 or 41-year-old woman named Lydia, and a 10-year-old boy named Smith fleeing together. I haven't found out anything else about their fate. You'll probably hear me say a number of times research is ongoing, because it is. My presumption here is that given the ages, it was probably a family that was fleeing together. Now, one other point can be made about faith in West Windsor as well. Per the church's own historical writings, the Dutch Neck Presbyterian Church, per a publication they actually made in 1966, one of the earliest members of the church in 1817 was an enslaved girl named Nancy, who was enslaved by William Post, who was one of the church's founding elders. It's also mentioned how a few enslaved individuals in the publication they made, they mention how a few enslaved individuals sat in the gallery of the church after it was built. I also noticed recently on a map of Mercer County in 1849, this interesting item, which you can see on the lower left. If you look at the circled area, it seems to imply that there was a free church off of Route 1 between Alexander Road and Washington Road, at least in the year 1849. Now, this could mean one of two things, to be clear. Well, likely one of two things, to be clear. One of them being either a free church in the Protestant sense, meaning a church that operated independent of state control and government funding, or it could be a church for free Black residents. But again, research is ongoing. Certainly want to find out what that is. So we're trying to learn more. Another thing I should mention is even the West Windsor History Museum's property is not free of the history of slavery. It's actually probably has the best documented ties to slavery of any property that still exists in town. An early landowner, for instance, Cornelius Van Voorhees, who owned about 800 acres of land in the area, kept enslaved people and bequeathed two young girls named Pat and Tennant to his wife and daughter. His cousin William was the specific individual who likely built the house and barn and established it as an independent farmstead. He too is also recorded as having enslaved individuals in 1784, although we unfortunately don't know their names. By the late 1700s, the property had passed to the Fisher family. In 1830, the census listed Jonathan Fisher, the family's patriarch, as enslaving one male aged 24 to 36 and one female aged 36 to 55. And again, we do not know their names because they never were recorded, at least in the documentation that we have. 19 years later, Jonathan Fisher also purchased what was then called the Updike Farm across the road. And his old farmhouse still stands amid the Cranberry Golf Course today, which you can see pictured here. It's in the center of that ellipse. And the 1860 census, by which time he was living at that very house at the golf course, what's now the golf course, shows several people living in his household, including Diana Updike, who I'd mentioned earlier. Diana Updike, at 76 years old, was listed as enslaved. And as I'll mention later on, this was about 14 years after New Jersey ostensibly but very weakly abolished slavery. Even Jonathan's will, written 3 years later in 1863, mentions Diana's status as property when he bequeathed her to his wife. The will also lists someone named Pompey Updike, who's probably known as one of West Windsor's best documented early free Black residents who lived nearby. And we're not quite certain whether or not this is the case, but I think it's likely that Pompey and Diana were related. But again, even if so, we don't know how specifically. One thing I should also point out is that the Cranberry Golf Course, the Skank Farmstead, and then there's also a yellow house right at the exit of Village Grand onto Old Trenton Road. All of those were part of the Fisher, a series of Fisher family farms. So they were all interrelated historically. Now, the road to abolition of slavery was long and ragged. Oftentimes you'll hear people justify slavery, saying that those are the morals of the days, but there have always been abolitionist voices, and enslaved people, of course, continually tried to break free of bondage over generations. So I don't quite agree with that argument. And I do want to emphasize that the enslaved themselves, of course, did much to further their own independence, from rebellions to advocating for legislation and cultural change, fighting in the Civil War, and much more. They were not just passive recipients of other people's benevolence. The enslaved also played a primary role, of course. I already mentioned how there were revolts, how Quakers hotly debated slavery, how during and after the Revolution, the contradiction of freedom and slavery was at the forefront of political discourse. And I think I mentioned this before, but in 1786, New Jersey passed legislation providing for regular freedom of those between the ages of 21 and 35. if local officials certified that the enslaved person could support themselves. However, this was repealed in 1798. Now, 6 years later, in 1804, the New Jersey state legislature passed what they called the Gradual Abolition Act, which required the registration of those born into slavery after July 4th of that year. And declared them quote unquote free, but I'm putting that in quotations because this law still bound them as children, as servants, until they were in their 20s, 21 for women and 25 for men, effectively continuing their slavery for another generation. Moreover, the law did absolutely nothing for those born before July 4th, 1804, so people who are already adults or even children in 1804 could still be effectively enslaved for life. For over the next 4 decades, a few other laws were passed in New Jersey addressing slavery, but none of them effectuated the institution's demise. And as a result, for instance, by 1830, about 2/3 of the enslaved population living in the North were held in New Jersey. New Jersey, it did have by far the highest proportion of enslaved living in northern states. In 1846, and I think I mentioned this prior, New Jersey nominally abolished slavery, but the act converted people still legally enslaved into apprentices for life. So, one example of a glaring loophole in that law, leaving many in effectively slavery-like conditions until the formal release or the final abolition of slavery with the 13th Amendment, or chattel slavery specifically. As previously mentioned, this was evidence in the fact that at the Fisher Farms in West Windsor, which again spanned what's now the Cranberry Golf Course, Gang Farmstead, and Village Grand, Jonathan Fisher kept Diana Updike enslaved into at least the year 1863, if not further. So, and one other question that I also got is, the Underground Railroad's role in West Windsor or relationship to West Windsor. Well, the Underground Railroad, again, for context, for those who might not know, it emerged gradually in the late 1700s as a loose, informal network that helped enslaved people escape to freedom. Rather than a real railroad, of course, it consisted of free Black communities, formerly enslaved people, and abolitionists who covertly provided shelter, guidance, and transportation. New Jersey lay directly along this route, and municipalities like Trenton, Princeton, and Newark each contained at least one stop. Pictured is a map of some of the Underground Railroad sites, and you'll notice that West Windsor, the blue star right here, is pretty close to the main route between Hamilton and Princeton. So there's a chance, again, this is not certain, but there's a chance that it may have been a pass-through town. Now, there's also been some speculation that I've heard that there's 1 or 2 sites in West Windsor that may have actually been Underground Railroad stops themselves. But to be upfront, I have not seen any concrete proof about this. That doesn't necessarily mean that that they aren't, just that we don't have any solid documentation yet. So, as I've said before, research is ongoing. I'd also mentioned before that, again, New Jersey passed a law in 1846 ostensibly to abolish slavery, but purposefully with glaring loopholes. And it really wasn't until after the Civil War that slavery was abolished. And to be clear, yes, the Civil War was largely fought over slavery. And even, Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens, who were president and vice president of the Confederacy, asserted that that was the reason. The Historical Society knows of a few dozen from the area who fought in the war, all for the Union side. And of course, there were, plenty of Black soldiers, some of them are pictured here, who fought in the war, although I don't think we have any yet confirmed from the West Windsor area specifically. Now, even amid the war, there were at least 2 enslaved in West Windsor. For instance, a newspaper article from 1862 talks about a woman named Sarah Cox who died that year at the age of 93. And I've already mentioned that there was Diana Updike, who was alive at least until 1863, if not later. This was a few months after President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which notably declared that all people in areas still in rebellion against the United States were free, but it did not free enslaved people in northern states. It didn't free people in loyal border states like Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, or in Confederate areas under Union control. This is one of the reasons that John Fisher was still able to enslave Diana up until 1863. In fact, it took until the passage of the 13th Amendment of the United States for slavery to be legally abolished at the federal level. Even so, New Jersey was the last northern state to sign it in January 1866 after rejecting it twice. This was actually the better part of a year after thousands in Texas were told that they were free 2 years late, which is one of the things that the holiday of Juneteenth, for instance, commemorates. Moreover, one thing I do want to point out is that the 13th Amendment did not actually abolish forced servitude entirely. There is, even to this day, still a clause in it allowing allowing there to be servitude. You can see this part that says, except as a punishment for crime, which perpetuates debates around underpaid labor in the prison system, for instance. Now, I do want to emphasize that slavery's impacts didn't, of course, just stop after the Civil War. Civil War is not where the impacts end. Because the clause in the 13th Amendment mentioned, and because there's the whole history of Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the Civil Rights movement, redlining, continuing debates on justice, rights, and safety to this day. This history of struggle, triumph, agency, community, and self-determination is part of an ongoing continuity. Slavery isn't something that just happened long ago. It's still relevant today and surprisingly recent. For instance, the last person whose parents, not grandparents, but parents were enslaved died only in 2022, 4 years ago. And it's estimated that and various sources that I found on this, so there's a pretty broad range, but it's estimated that today about 70 to 90% of Black residents in the U.S. descend from people who were enslaved in the U.S. or the broader Americas. We're still doing research at the Historical Society on what happened to formerly enslaved laborers. I was also reading a comment that someone made. We're also still doing research on what happened to the formerly enslaved in West Windsor after the war, because again, very little is currently known what happened after in West Windsor specifically. For instance, some of them may have continued to work on local farms, albeit as freed workers or paid servants. And it's unclear how many Black communities formed in the town in the town in the late 1800s or early 1900s. I'm mentioning that just because we got a comment about that or question about that. What we do know, however, is that many of the mid-20th century migrant workers who lived here, for example, here's a picture of a family from the Library of Congress. These were workers that often traveled as families up during the summer months to work on farms in more northern states. That a lot of them were descended from enslaved individuals. And yes, there are descendants of some of the enslaving families living in the area as well, the Clarks, Fishers, and others. Unfortunately, again, because this is a single lecture that I'm trying to fit everything into about 60 minutes, including Q&A, we can't fit all this history into this single lecture, which is why I'm planning on having more. But I do want to point out that in other lectures, we have talked about how, for instance, 1930s era deeds for Berrien City, one of West Windsor's historic neighborhoods by the Princeton Junction train station, had clauses preventing non-white residents from living there. And again, recently we installed and did a lecture on Glen Acres, which was a small community, again, off of Alexander Road, that was built by civil rights activists as one of the nation's earliest deliberately integrated communities. And that neighborhood was set up in direct response to racism and housing discrimination in Princeton, where Black residents were often relegated to, or nearly constantly relegated to, the Witherspoon-Jackson neighborhood. I also do want to emphasize that there are certainly many, many other sources out there to learn more. For instance, I would say the Stoutsburg Salland Mountain African American History Museum, based out of the historic Mount Zion AME Church in Skillman, does fantastic work to preserve and share the history of African Americans in central New Jersey. And I believe it's central New Jersey's first Black History Museum. I'd also recommend visiting, of course, the African American History Museum in Washington, D.C. It's extraordinarily detailed, and you have to dedicate basically your whole day to going through it because it is a lot of information. Here in West Windsor, Plainsboro, although not maybe or maybe not is directly related to educating people about slavery. We have the African American Parent Support Group, which provides resources for Black and African American community. Although I do believe they have done history lectures in the past, and someone correct me if I'm wrong about that. Now, ultimately, this history that we're talking about is not just, things that happened in the past. It's also about people whose names were often erased. If today's lecture helps even a few of those individuals be remembered again, then I would consider it a success. However, I do want to emphasize that this is also should not stand by itself. Recently, for instance, the Historic Society installed some signage at the Skank Farmstead highlighting the farms and the town's ties to slavery. So if you go to the farm, you'll be able to see this sign. However, I don't want that to be the only thing we do, of course. This is just the beginning. For example, there's opportunities I could, see a local Black history trail being created, or creating a monument to, or a parklet memorializing the names of those who were enslaved, which you're actually going to see the full list, well, not the full list, but a list of them on the next page, or, making a map of all the local sites that we can confirm to be associated with local slavery. However, again, this takes time, this takes effort. So so do please consider volunteering with us. We would love to have more people helping us do this research and actually making these things happen. With that, I do want to end this lecture with a screen again showing all the names of those enslaved that we know of at the moment. These are people whose names we know. And on the bottom right, I do want to highlight that there's a lot of people whose names we don't know, but we know that they existed. For example, if there's a tax roll from the 1770s that says that Christopher Fisher enslaved 2 people, it's not going to list their names, but we know they existed. These are people who deserve to be remembered. To that end, again, if you want to volunteer, if you want to help out, please do so. And with that, again, I'd love to talk more about this, but we do have a time limit. So I'll open up the chat to questions. I'll let people unmute yourselves if you want to do so, and we can kind of have a discussion and kind of work on a Q&A session.
Paul, this is John Rader.
Yes.
The late Ray Rader, whom you know.
Yeah.
During the mid-60s and the early 70s, until we had the gasoline crisis, was the organizer of the socials that the churches in Princeton organized for the farm workers. And my job was to organize the drivers who went out to the farms to pick up the migrants.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I also see that Linda Oppenheim has a question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. This was really wonderful. You just packed so much into a very short period of time, and all of it very substantive. I'm interested in descendants of people who were enslaved, but also possibly descendants of people who were enslavers who are still in the area. Yeah. Do you have information about that?
We generally do. Sorry, in terms of the descendants of people who were enslaved in the area, we don't have anything because the documentation is so sparse. That's where I'll have to go back to the phrase, research is ongoing. In terms of descendants of enslavers, it's most of the old colonial names. I would say Fisher, Clark, Voorhees. I don't know how many of them still live in town, but or move to other states. But those are usually the families. One question: have I received pushback from West Windsor residents about publicly resurfing this history? Only at like a personal level of some individuals saying, maybe you shouldn't do this. But the vast majority that I've talked to would have explicitly said that, they want this history to be told. And even if, they didn't, it needs to be told. Another comment from Pat Donahue. I've done a lot of research on slavery in East Windsor. Would like to share what I know with you. Perhaps we can help one another with our ongoing research. Perfect. Yes. Yeah. So, Patricia, if you'd like to just email me after this and we can kind of coordinate. And by the way, it's the participants are split into two screens for me, so I can't actually see the first page. So if anyone happens to have their hand raised, feel free to unmute and you can ask the question because it's not easy for me to see everyone who has their hand raised. Princeton University professor wrote a book on a legal case that raised the issue of who's responsible for paying for the care of an enslaved person. That's a valuable resource as well. Yeah, yeah, Linda.
Sorry, if nobody else is asking. I just wanted to mention, and I'm sure you know about the Lost Souls memorial from that's close by. It's in is it in East Windsor or maybe a little farther north, where there was a corrupt judge who, after transatlantic slavery was abolished and the domestic slave trade really ramped up, they actually kidnapped people. They advertised falsely that they were going to give people jobs or unite them with people showed up and then they were captured and they were going to be um, transported to the South.
Mhm.
People who were free were enslaved. It was a real scandal. And you know they've tried to rename a street that is named for that judge. East Brunswick. Yes, thank you. Sorry.
Perfect.
Um, and it's a really chilling story that's too little known, having
Mhm.
happened so close by in New Jersey.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, yeah. No, actually, this is the first I'm hearing of that. So thank you for that. And yeah, thank you, Pat, as well. East Brunswick, but moved to New Brunswick apparently. And that's where I go back to. I would love for there to be, at least a memorial in West Windsor to those who were enslaved. This is a list of, I think it's something like 87 names that we know, and then however many others unknown that we don't quite know yet. So I'd love for there to be something, and we'll have to talk to the Historical Society. But again, if anyone wants to help with this research, please reach out because I'd love to have more progress being made on this and kind of furthering this as well. Okay. With that, I don't see any other questions in the meantime. Thank you, Lynn. So I think that is it for the lecture. Thank you all very much. And yes, it is recorded, by the way, so this will be put up onto YouTube. So you'll all get an email when it's put up. But thank you all for coming. I appreciate you showing up and being engaged.